All right, y'all. I want to welcome you to Pastor's Point of View. My name is Dr. Andy Woods, and we're coming to you today with a special Pastor's Point of View. What we're going to deal with in this session is, I think, a very important issue, and it has to do with this subject: what is wrong with replacement theology? Well, let's kind of start off with a definition. What is replacement theology? Most Christians, by way of denominational affiliation, whether they realize it or not, are in churches that teach some form of replacement theology. Replacement theology is the idea that God has divorced the nation of Israel. In fact, some replacement theologians will tell you that the seven-sealed scroll that Christ opens in Revelation chapter 5 is Israel's divorce decree. God is finished with Israel as a nation. And any blessings that the nation of Israel had have now been transferred over to the church. And they call the church the New Israel. They call the church the New Israel, even though the word Israel is never used of the church a single time in the New Testament. And it's sort of interesting what they do here. They have to adopt a spiritualizing, non-literal approach to the Bible to transfer Israel's blessings to the church, because Israel's blessings were always physical and material. And suddenly we discover that these blessings now belong to the church in a spiritual form, which is a problem because they've moved away from a literal approach to the whole Bible. And it's very interesting, they never transfer the curses to the church. You know, the nation of Israel, as part of her covenants in the Mosaic covenant, has blessings for obedience, Deuteronomy 28, verses 1 through 14, and curses for disobedience, Deuteronomy 28, verses 15 through 68. They never transfer the curses. They leave those behind for the Jewish people, but they transfer all of Israel's blessings, spiritually speaking, through a non-literal method of interpretation to the church. And this is what we mean by replacement theology. Consequently, they do not believe that Israel has a future as a nation. The best thing, the only real hope for the Jewish people, is they could get saved and become members of the church, but there really is no hope for the nation of Israel as a nation. There's no future for Israel. Her inheritance has been cut off and transferred to the church. And really the fancy name that is given for this is supersessionism. Don't let that word scare you. Supersessionism basically means that the church has superseded Israel's place in the outworking of God's purposes. And if we can put up slide number 2, let me just show you how prominent replacement theology is. Most people have heard of R.C. Sproul, the late R.C. Sproul. And while R.C. Sproul may have had some good things to say, he was very much steeped in replacement theology. He says here in his Table Talk magazine, "We believe that the church is essentially Israel. We believe that the answer to the question, what about the Jews, is here we are." And then he goes on and he calls the church the Israel of God. That's supersessionism, or replacement theology, as articulated by the late R.C. Sproul. Taking a look at slide number 3, I really appreciate Arnold Fruchtenbaum's response to what Sproul said in his Table Talk magazine. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, a Hebrew Christian scholar, responds this way to Sproul's assertion, what about the Jews? Here we are as the church. Fruchtenbaum says it's a good thing he was not declaring this on the streets of Berlin, Germany around 1941. So that's just a tremendous response by Fruchtenbaum. But at least now you're getting sort of a hint as to what supersessionism or replacement theology is. There's a lot of teaching that goes under the rubric of replacement theology, but most people can't recognize it for what it is because it flies just a tad under the radar. So, for example, putting up slide number 4, you'll notice this quote by John Piper. John Piper says this: "All Israel will someday turn to the Lord Christ as a group. The broken off branches," speaking of Romans 11, "will be grafted in one day to the people of God, the bride of Christ, his church." And a lot of people look at a statement like that by John Piper and they said he doesn't teach replacement theology. Look, he believes that the Jews are going to be incorporated in mass into the church. And this may be a less aggressive form of replacement theology, but it is replacement theology nonetheless. It marginalizes or lowers what God has said concerning the future for the nation of Israel. Looking at slide number 5, you'll notice this response by British scholar Paul Wilkinson responding to John Piper. Wilkinson says, on the basis of this kind of statement, many in the church are being misled into believing that Piper stands with Israel, but he does not. What Piper said is not what Paul taught. Israel's destiny as a nation is not one of spiritual incorporation into the church, which is the classic Reformed Calvinistic teaching. Wilkinson says the appointed destiny for Israel is for her to remain a nation in the sight of God and in the midst of all of the nations for as long as the fixed order of creation endures. Jeremiah chapter 31 and verse 36. So even though Piper believes in a lot of Jews could get saved in the church age, he still teaches replacement theology because he denies a future role for Israel, not in terms of becoming members of the church, but in terms of her future as a distinct nation. So this is what we mean by replacement theology. So in this presentation, we're asking and answering, looking at slide 6 here, actually 7 problems with replacement theology. We're asking and answering the question, what is wrong with replacement theology? And very quickly, sort of in rapid fire, we're going to give you 7 reasons why replacement theology is wrong. So let's kind of move through our list if we could. And reason number 1, the first problem with replacement theology, number 1, is replacement theology is not biblical. I mean, it's just not what the Bible teaches. For example, you'll notice Isaiah 43 and verse 1. And this is what God says concerning the nation of Israel. God says, "Your creator, O Jacob, and he who formed you, O Israel." Now, when you study Isaiah 43, you'll learn that the same Hebrew verbs used by God to create the cosmos, the heavens and the earth in Genesis 1, are the same Hebrew verbs in this chapter, not just this verse, but in this whole chapter to describe the creation of the nation of Israel. In other words, just as God created the heavens and the earth, he created the nation of Israel. The nation of Israel is the only nation that's ever existed in the history of mankind that was specifically and especially created by God. Now, why did God create Israel? Notice Genesis 12 and verse 3. Notice what it says: "I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse." This is the patriarch Abraham, then called Abram, that God used to bring forth the nation of Israel. "In you all the families of the earth will be blessed." So God created Israel to be a blessing to the rest of the world. God created Israel to bless that nation. And through that nation, his blessings would spill over to the rest of the world. Israel's blessings aren't just for Israel, but are for the whole world, but they are to be channeled to the whole world through the vehicle of the nation of Israel. And as you take a look at slide number 10, you see that God has done a pretty good job, hasn't he? Blessing the world through the nation of Israel. Every single blessing that we enjoy today as Gentile Christians has come to us through the physical descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We would have no spiritual blessings today had it not been for God's past work through the physical descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the nation of Israel. The scripture came to us through the Jewish people. Romans 3 verse 2 says to them, Israel was given the oracles of God. Every biblical writer we have was Jewish. The only one people debate anymore is Luke, who wrote Luke and Acts. Beyond that, every single author of Scripture was Jewish. Number 2, the Savior, Jesus Christ, was Jewish. There's a genealogy in Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 through 18, which links Jesus back to David and back to Abraham. Jesus said in John 4, verse 22, salvation is of the Jews. We would have no Scripture and we would have no Savior had it not been for God's work through the physical descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And there's a third blessing that's on the horizon. It's the kingdom. The kingdom is not going to be headquartered in Washington, D.C. or any other pagan Gentile city. It's not going to be headquartered in Brussels or Rome or any other place. It's going to be headquartered in the city of Jerusalem, Isaiah 2, chapter 2, verses 2 and 3. And so this is the outworking of God's purposes. He created Israel and blessed Israel to be a blessing to the world. 2 of those blessings we've received. One is yet future in what is called the millennial kingdom. And as you take a look at slide number 11, you see the calling of Abraham, then named Abram. He was called from the Ur of the Chaldeans. He was an idolater. He was sort of sanctified from his pagan background by God. He was told to walk by faith. And as he walked by faith, God was going to take him to a land or a place that Abraham knew nothing of. And so this is the beginning of the nation of Israel. And as God is dealing with Abraham in this way, notice, if you will, slide number 12, Genesis chapter 15 and verse 18. This is what God said to Abraham. And this verse here that I'm reading very well could be the most important verse of the whole Bible. In fact, my professor in seminary, J. Dwight Pentecost, said if you can understand Genesis 15, the most important chapter of the Bible, you can understand the whole Bible. Because all God is doing in the rest of the Bible is making good on the promises that he has made in Genesis 15 in the beginning of what is called the Abrahamic covenant. Notice what Genesis 15 and verse 18 says. It says, on that day the Lord made a covenant. Now you notice we have covenant there underlined. A covenant is like a contract. God has contractually bound himself to act on behalf of particular people. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I have given this land from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the Euphrates. Now, this covenant called the Abrahamic covenant, there's really 2 things to understand about it. 2 words. Each of these words begins with the letter U. So the first thing to understand about this covenant is that it is unconditional, meaning it rests completely and totally on the shoulders of God to fulfill its terms. It doesn't rest on the performance of Abram, who later became Abraham, and his fickle behavior and the fickle behavior of God, Abraham's descendants. Slide number 13 gives all of the reasons why the covenant is unconditional, not conditional. And I wish we had time to work our way through all of those things on slide number 13. But just for purposes of brevity, if you look at slide 14, we begin to understand why this covenant is unconditional. It has to do with the ancient Near East covenant ratification ceremony. And you should study very carefully Genesis 15, because what is involved there is a covenant ratification ceremony. It's how covenants were entered into in the ancient Near East at the time Abraham lived. And what they did is they took animals and they severed them into parts, and they put those two rows, if you will, of animal parts in parallel rows, and the parties to the agreement passed through the animal pieces. And when the parties to the agreement passed through the animal pieces, they were basically signifying through this ritual that if we don't fulfill our obligations under the covenant, then let us be cut asunder as these animal pieces have been cut asunder. So it was a very solemn occasion. And what's interesting about this whole thing is when you study Genesis 15, God took Abram and put him to sleep. And God alone, Genesis 15, passed through those severed animal parts. And if the covenant was conditional, Abraham would have passed through the animal pieces, but he did not. God alone is represented by the oven and the torch passed through the animal pieces. And what God is saying is, if I don't fulfill my obligations under the Abrahamic covenant, then let me be torn asunder as these animals have been torn asunder. So the covenant is unconditional. It's not a situation where Israel does X and God is obligated to do Y. The whole issue here is God has obligated himself to act no matter what Israel does. Not only is this covenant unconditional, but as you look at slide number 15, the covenant is unfulfilled. It's never been fulfilled in history. In fact, that lighter area there on our map on slide 15 is all of the territory God gave to Abraham in the Abrahamic covenant, really a tract of real estate that goes from modern-day Egypt to modern-day Iraq, in between the Nile and the Euphrates. And that little darker area is what the Joshua generation got. Remember, Joshua conquered the land, and that's this very small portion that they received. And even today, the nation of Israel has but a fraction of everything that God has promised to the nation of Israel. And so if you understand these two things about the Abrahamic covenant, you'll understand the whole Bible. And you'll understand why Israel always, before God, has a future. The covenant that he entered into with her is unconditional. And number two, unfulfilled. And as you take a look at slide number 16, you'll see what God promised to the patriarch Abraham in this covenant. He promised her three things: land, seed or descendants, and then personal blessing. And then what God does subsequently in biblical history is he comes along through sub-covenants that he makes with the nation of Israel, and he amplifies each of those promises. The land aspect is amplified in the land covenant. The seed aspect is amplified in the Davidic covenant. The blessing aspect is amplified in the new covenant. But if you can understand Israel's covenantal structure, unconditional, unfulfilled, and literal, you can understand why replacement theology has to be wrong. You can't have a scenario where the nation of Israel has been cut off from the purposes of God, because God made Israel a covenant which is unconditional and unfulfilled. And if everything that I've said is true, then it's just a matter of time before God reaches out his hand into history and executes exactly what he promised to do for the nation of Israel. Ezekiel 36, I don't think we have a slide on this, but Ezekiel 36 is that famous chapter where the nation of Israel, it's predicted in the end times, will be regathered to her own land. And notice what Ezekiel 36 verse 22 says. God says through the prophet Ezekiel to the Jewish people, "It is not for your sake, O house of Israel, that I am about to act, but for my holy name, which you have profaned among the nations." In other words, God is acting in history in the future on behalf of the nation of Israel, not because of Israel and her performance, but because of his holy name. And I think that's referring back to the Abrahamic covenant and what God has obligated himself to do in the Abrahamic covenant. And you start to see this, and you see very fast why the nation of Israel has a future in God. Zechariah 12 and verse 10, looking at slide 17, God says this: "I will pour out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplication, so that they will look upon me whom they have pierced. They will mourn for him as one mourns for an only son, and they will weep bitterly over him like the weeping of a firstborn. That's God moving his hand and fulfilling his obligations one day under the Abrahamic covenant. Notice Romans 11, taking a look at Romans 11, slide 18, verses 25 and 26. Paul says, I do not want you, brethren, to be uninformed of this mystery, so that you will not be wise in your own estimation, that a partial hardening, notice the word partial, a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, and so all Israel will be saved, just as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will remove ungodliness from Jacob. Notice that Israel's hardening today is partial. It's going to last until God is finished bringing in the Gentiles in the church age. And the day is going to come when all Israel will be saved. So replacement theology chops off Israel as a future nationally. Why is that wrong? It's unbiblical. For God to do that would be to deny what he has covenanted himself to do in the Abrahamic covenant. In fact, the only way, looking at slide 19, that you could get rid of Israel is to get rid of the sun and the moon and the stars. Jeremiah 31, verses 35 through 37, God says, Thus saith the Lord, who gives the sun for light by day, and the fixed order of the moon and the stars for light by night. Jumping down there to verse 36, if this fixed order departs from me, declares the Lord, then the offspring of Israel will cease from being a nation before me. If you want to get rid of Israel, don't aim your rockets and your bombs and your tanks at the nation of Israel. Aim them at the sun and the moon and the stars. Why is that? Because God has said, as long as that fixed order abides or remains, Israel will always be a nation before me. So what is wrong with replacement theology? The first problem with it is it's unbiblical. To cut off Israel as a nation and say she has no future nationally is to deny what God has covenanted himself to do in the Abrahamic covenant. Let me take you to a second reason, if I could, as to why replacement theology is wrong. Number two, replacement theology, simply put, not only is it not even part of the Bible, but it's not part of early Christianity. Now, if you go back to the first 2 centuries of Christians, first 200 years of the church after the apostles had passed on, nobody in the early church believed in replacement theology. In fact, here's a quote from a famous church father named Justin Martyr in his dialogue with Tryphos, slide number 21. He wrote this, I think, about AD 160. And notice what he says, but I and every other completely Orthodox Christian feel that there will be a resurrection of the flesh, feel certain, rather, that there will be a resurrection of the flesh, followed by 1,000 years in the rebuilt, embellished, and enlarged city of Jerusalem, as was announced by the prophets Ezekiel, Isaiah, and the others. In other words, we are certain of something, he says, that there's going to be a 1,000-year earthly kingdom in which God is going to fulfill his promises to the nation of Israel in the enlarged city of Jerusalem. And he says, if you don't believe that, we don't consider you an Orthodox Christian. So you notice that he attached words like certainty and orthodoxy to a belief that there was going to be a future nationally for Israel. These folks called themselves Chiliasts. Kilia is simply the Greek word 1,000, which you find 6 times to describe the millennial kingdom in Revelation 20, verses 1 through 10. Today we would call them premillennialists, but back in that day they called themselves Chiliasts. And so for 2 centuries, this is how the church thought. In fact, if you stood up in this group and started to argue for replacement theology or supersessionism, you would have been laughed right out of the building, because nobody in the first 2 centuries of the church believed that. So what went wrong? Well, if you look at slide 22, you see 2 circles there. There's a circle up north over a city called Antioch, and then there's another circle down south over a city named Alexandria, Egypt. And those 2 circles represent the 2 dominant thoughts, 2 different schools of thought within Christianity. That upper circle is where all of the early chiliasts, premillennialists we call them today, came from. They took Bible prophecy literally, and that's the mindset that dominated the church for the first 2 centuries. In fact, if you look at slide 23, you can see a kind of a closer map of those 2 cities. So Antioch, with its belief in a literal interpretation of prophecy, ruled the day in Christianity for the first 2 centuries. But down south, in Alexandria, Egypt, another school of thought developed, and they began to take Bible prophecy allegorically. And sadly, what happened is Alexandria, with their allegorical, non-literal approach to Bible prophecy, eventually eclipsed Antioch. And by the time you get to Augustine, who in the 4th century wrote his book, The City of God, which I believe is the first treatment of what we call replacement theology or amillennialism in the church, by the time that happened, replacement theology began to rule the day. In fact, Augustine's book, The City of God, is probably the most influential book in church history. And when I say influence, I'm not necessarily talking about an influence for good. I'm talking about an influence for evil or bad. And once that book was published and began to be well known, Augustine, you might remember, was converted out of paganism. To my knowledge, he didn't even really know Hebrew, in which the Old Testament was written. And by the time he wrote that book and amillennialism began to rule the day, what happened is Alexandria began to eclipse Antioch. And there were a lot of factors in this eclipse. Gnosticism was coming to the surface at this time. Gnosticism is this idea that the physical world is evil and the spiritual world is good, Gnostic dualism. So if the physical world is evil, then we can't have a physical kingdom of God on the earth focused around the nation of Israel. The Jewish population in the church began to decline. Illiteracy came to the forefront, and people really didn't have a Bible that they could use to check the false idea of replacement theology. If you're interested in this transition, I did write a book on this called Ever Reforming, and you can find that book. It's an easy read. It's written for lay people. You can find it wherever books are sold, Amazon or wherever or whatnot, or go to my website, andywoodsministries.org. You should be able to purchase the book there. It's available as a hard copy or in ebook format. It'll explain to you in layman's terms how Antioch was eclipsed by Alexandria and how replacement theology began to be pushed out of the church, and how the church, beginning really dominantly in the 4th century, moved into replacement theology. But my point is, before this eclipse happened, the early Christians never believed in replacement theology. The first 2 centuries of the church know virtually nothing about replacement theology. And sadly, this is a shadow that Augustine's shadow that we're still under today. We barely started kind of climbing out of it with the Protestant Reformation and are still climbing out of it today. But replacement theology was unknown in the first 2 centuries of the church. So why should you reject replacement theology? Number one, it's not in the Bible. It contradicts the very covenants of God. And number two, it's unknown in early Christendom or early church history. As we put up slide number 24, let me take you to a third reason why replacement theology is wrong and replacement theology should be rejected. Number 3, replacement theology is rooted in human pride. Now, you might listen to me say that, and you might be saying to yourself, well, that's a very harsh critique. Are you just going to call your theological opponents prideful? Isn't that the easy way out? Let me say something to you about this. This is not my opinion. This is what God says through the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 11, verse 18. What Paul says is if you are into replacement theology, you have a pride or arrogance problem. Notice, if you will, Romans chapter 11. As we look at slide number 25, you might remember Romans 11. It's Paul's extended metaphor of the olive tree. And in this particular metaphor, he talks about natural branches which have been broken out of the tree. Now, the olive tree is the Abrahamic covenant that we spoke of a little while ago. The natural branches broken out of the tree is the Jewish nation or the Jewish people that have been temporarily pushed out of their own tree through unbelief. And then Paul talks about wild branches, branches that don't belong, unnatural branches that have been grafted into that tree. In other words, the natural branches have been temporarily broken out, and what has taken their place temporarily are unnatural branches. And Paul's point in this olive tree metaphor is simply this. If God has already done the greater agricultural miracle, connecting wild branches to a tree when those branches don't even belong in that tree to begin with, how hard is it for God to reach out and restore the natural branches one day to their own tree? And that's exactly what God intends to do. So the tree is the Abrahamic covenant. The natural branches that have been broken off the tree are the the Jews that have been pushed out of their tree through unbelief. But the wild branches that have been brought in, who is that? That's me. That's you. That's Gentile Christians. Because we are believers in the Messiah that Israel nationally rejected, Jesus or Yeshua, we've been brought into the benefits of that tree, and that's a miracle. And the fact that God can bring unnatural branches into the tree, which is the greater miracle, how difficult is it for God to one day reach out his hand in history and restore the natural branches to their own tree? And in the process of giving this extended metaphor, Paul deals here in Romans 11 with the attitude of the unnatural branches, the Gentiles brought into the tree, towards the natural branches, or the Jews that have been cut off from the tree. And notice what Paul says, looking at slide number 26. It's in Romans chapter 11, verse 18. He says something very interesting here. He says to us unnatural branches, us Gentiles, he says, do not be arrogant towards the branches. Speaking there of the natural branches. Unnatural branches, don't be arrogant towards the natural branches. But if you are arrogant, remember that it is not you who supports the root, but the root supports you. So in the process of developing this extended metaphor, he deals with the attitude of the unnatural branches, or the Gentiles, to the natural branches, or the Jews, who have been broken off in unbelief, and he specifically says, do not be arrogant. You know, arrogance is, we're in this tree, and the natural branches are out of the tree, and they have no future. Paul says that whole theological position, replacement theology, comes from an atmosphere or an attitude of pride. Notice the repetition of the word arrogant there in verse 18. And I find this very interesting because when we discuss replacement theology today, we talk about hermeneutics, proper interpretation, proper context, proper Bible study methods. That's not what Paul talks about. Paul talks about an attitude of the heart. In other words, if you have a method of interpretation which cuts out the Jewish people and says they have no future, you can masquerade it however you want to masquerade it as any type of hermeneutic or method of interpretation. But Paul says there in verse 18, it's a heart problem. So number 3, why should we reject replacement theology? Because of where replacement theology ultimately comes from. It's rooted in human pride. Which takes us to a 4th reason as to why we should reject replacement theology. If replacement theology is true, it renders all of God's promises, including the promises that he has made to us as Gentile Christians, it renders all of those promises as unreliable. Looking at slide 28, you remember God made a covenant with the nation of Israel, unconditional and unfulfilled. Looking at slide number 29, you'll remember that the promises in the Abrahamic covenant, land, seed, and blessing, is the foundation of everything that God has promised to the nation of Israel. And here's the bottom line. If God can break that, if he can break his word on that issue, then any promise that he's ever made anywhere in the Bible, whether it's in John 3:16 or any other place of the Bible, is not worth the paper that it's written on, because God is a covenant-breaking, promise-breaking God, rendering all of his promises therefore unreliable. In other words, replacement theology takes God's very character and puts it on trial. It turns God into a liar or a deceiver or someone who is untrustworthy. If God can break his word to the Jew, then he's untrustworthy. And if he's untrustworthy, how can you trust him for any other promise that he has made throughout the scripture? And if you understand this, taking a look at slide 30, you understand very clearly the outline of the book of Romans. You know, the book of Romans is probably one of the most, if not the most, logically organized books in the entire Bible. In fact, I'm told in early America, the book of Romans at one time was used as a model for attorneys, showing attorneys how to logically argue a case. And here, I think, is Charles Ryrie's outline for Romans. We have the salutation section, the sin section, the salvation section, the sanctification section, the sovereignty section, the service section, and the summation section. And you look there, looking at slide 31, section number 4, sanctification, chapters 6 through 8. And read sometime about the amazing promises that God has made to Gentile Christians at the end of Romans 8. For example, look at Romans 8, verses 29 and 30, slide number 32. What does Paul say there? For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to become conformed to the image of his Son, so that he would be the firstborn among many brethren. And those whom he predestined, he also called. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified. So we have been foreknown in God, predestined, called, justified. And look at the end there, verse 30. We're already glorified. Now, do I look glorified to you? I doubt it. I sure don't feel glorified. But my glorification is such a done deal in the eyes of God. God can speak of it as if it's already happened. In fact, when you go over to Romans 8, 38 and 39, these incredible promises continue. And there we learn that nothing can separate us from the love of God. Now, think about this for a minute. If God can break his word to Israel, then what do those promises actually mean? They mean nothing. Because probably at this point, some guy in the back of the room stuck his hand up and said, you know, Paul, I've got a question. These are tremendous promises here in Romans 8, but it looks like God has broken the Abrahamic covenant. And if God has broken the Abrahamic covenant, he's untrustworthy. And so how can I trust him to keep his promises to me at the end of Romans 8? And that's why Romans 8 is followed by Romans 9. Romans 8, as you know, comes before Romans 9. Actually, Romans 9, 10, and 11. And looking at slide number 33, what is Romans 9 through 11 about? See, a lot of people will tell you that Romans 9 through 11 is just a digression. It's an afterthought. Replacement theologians themselves, almost when you look at their commentaries on Romans, have no idea what to do with Romans 9 through 11. But I'm here to tell you that Romans 9 through 11 is an intricate and critical part of Paul's argument. He says in Romans 9 through 11, here's the point or the theme: how can God be trusted to be faithful to us if he has been unfaithful to Israel? And that's the subject that Paul is getting into in Romans 9, 10, and 11. That's why, looking at slide number 34, the sanctification section is followed by the sovereignty section. What's Paul doing in Romans 9, 10, and 11? Taking a look at slide number 35, there's a very simple outline to this. Israel in the past elected. Romans 9. Israel in the present rejected temporarily because of unbelief in her own Messiah, Romans 10. And then he ends it with Romans 11, Israel in the future accepted. He says all Israel will be saved. The day in history will come where God will take the natural branches and put them back into her own olive tree. And so if God has not forgotten Israel, then every single promise he has made at the end of Romans 8, you can take it to the bank. Because by the time you get to Romans 8 and you get through that, you see these incredible promises, but the Israel question is nagging you with doubt. If God can break his word to Israel, then he can break his word to me in Romans 8. So Paul explains as an intricate part of his argument, Romans 9, 10, and 11, God has not forgotten Israel. In fact, he has a grand plan in mind whereby he will keep every single promise he has made to the physical descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And if that's true, that's a God you can trust. Romans 8. Take Romans 8 to the bank. And that's why Romans 9, 10, and 11 is followed by Romans 12, verse 1. Look at slide 36, Romans 12, verse 1. What does Paul say after he finishes the Israel discussion? Therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God. What mercies of God? The mercies of God towards Israel that we just got finished learning about in Romans 9, 10, and 11, to present your bodies as a living and holy sacrifice acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. In other words, if God is trustworthy, this is a God you can build your life on. He's not going to pull the carpet out from under you. So go on ahead and present your body to him as a living sacrifice. And that's why, looking at slide number 37, Romans 9, 10, and 11 is followed by the service section, which is prefaced by how we are to present our bodies unto the Lord as a living sacrifice. You see how logically constructed the book of Romans is? Romans 9, 10, 11 is not some kind of digression. It's an intricate part of Paul's argument. Here's the bottom line, is if replacement theology is true, God is a liar. Notice again, slide number 38, Romans chapter 11, verse 18. Remember what Paul says over there. Do not be arrogant towards the branches. If you are arrogant, remember that it is not you who supports the root, but the root supports you. God cannot lie. It's impossible for God to lie. As demonstrated by his commitment to keeping every promise he has ever made to the physical descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so if that's true, then the promises he's made to you are true as well. See, you deny Israel's role as a nation, it's like sitting out on the branch of a tree and cutting out the log from under you. You're cutting off yourself. Because if God is going to break his word to Israel the way replacement theologians teach, he could break his word to any of us. Which takes us to a fifth reason why I think we need to reject replacement theology. Number 5, replacement theology, when you buy into it, it blinds people. It's a blinder. It blinds people to what God is doing today. What is God doing today? Notice slide number 40. Notice Ezekiel 36. And notice, if you will, verses 24 through 28. What is God doing today? He's doing a lot of things. But notice what Ezekiel 36 says. For I will take you from the nations, that's Israel, and gather you from all the lands and bring you into your own land. Israel is going to be physically regathered to her own land. Verse 25, then I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. I will put, down in verse 26, a new spirit within you. There's a twofold regathering that's described here. First, Israel is going to be rebrought back into her own land. And once that is accomplished, then God is going to pour out his spirit upon the nation of Israel. First, Israel will be restored politically. Then Israel will be restored spiritually as the breath or the Holy Spirit comes upon the nation. Now, this point that he makes in Ezekiel 36 is illustrated in Ezekiel 37, verses 7 through 11, in the vision of the valley of the dry bones. Ezekiel, back in the 6th century BC, saw all of these bones spread out in a valley. He saw the bones sort of assemble themselves to form a human skeleton. Then he saw sinews and muscles and skin form on that skeleton, so it became a living being. And then Ezekiel says this, there was no breath in them. By the way, he describes Ezekiel, these bones being assembled together, Ezekiel 37, verse 7, as a rattling sound, a loud noise. Would you say that the process of Israel being regathered to her own land today in our own lifetime is noisy? It's very noisy. In fact, most of our headlines and United Nations conference meetings, etc., seem to deal with that subject. But then Ezekiel says when he saw this skeleton form, there was no breath in them. So I prophesied as he commanded me, and breath came into them, and they came to life. And the Bible is very clear, verse 11, these bones are not the First Baptist Church of whatever. These bones are the whole house of Israel. So what's happening here in the end times is Israel is restored politically, then she is going to be restored spiritually. Now, if you want to know what time period we're living in between those two regatherings. It's an amazing time to be alive. Israel has been brought back into her land politically, but we're still waiting for her spiritual rebirth, which will take place relative to the events of the coming 7-year tribulation period. If you look at slide number 42, I really like this graphic that my friend Dr. Randall Price of World of the Bible Ministries has put together to describe these two regatherings in one of his books. He talks about first the present regathering. He calls it a first regathering. And that's to be contrasted with the permanent second regathering that's on the horizon. In the first regathering, Israel returns to part of the land. In the second regathering, she'll return to all of the land. She will occupy everything that God has given to Israel in the Abrahamic covenant from modern-day Egypt to modern-day Iraq. In the first regathering that we're seeing today, I believe, Israel returns in unbelief, but in the second regathering, she'll return in faith. In the first regathering, she's restored to the land only. In the second regathering, she will be restored to the land and the Lord. The first regathering is setting the stage for the tribulation period. It's setting the stage for discipline, but the second regathering at the end of the tribulation period will set the stage for blessing or set the stage for the millennial kingdom. And beloved, let me tell you something. We're living right in between those two regatherings. We're living in between the skeleton forming, but we're still waiting for the breath. That's the time period that we're living in. We're living in some amazing times. That's why I appreciate this quote here from W.E. Blackstone in his classic best-selling book, 1908, 40 years before Israel was regathered as a nation, entitled Jesus is Coming. Blackstone says, Israel is God's sundial. If anyone desires to know our place in God's chronology, our position in the great march of events, look at Israel. There's no denying the fact that Israel today is very politically, prophetically significant. Notice this quote from one of the great prophecy scholars of the past, Dr. John Walvert. He writes, of the many peculiar phenomena which characterize the present generation, few events can claim equal significance as far as biblical prophecy is concerned with that of the return of Israel to their land. It constitutes preparation for the end of the age, the setting for the coming of the Lord for his church, and the fulfillment of Israel's prophetic destiny. Let me ask you a question. How many Jebusites do you know? We don't say so-and-so and so-and-so moved in down the street. Very nice Jebusite couple. I mean, what happened to the Jebusites? What happened to the Canaanites, the Girgashites, the Amalekites? As we jokingly like to say, what happened to the electric lights and the out-of-sites and the termites and all of those ites that we read about in the book of Genesis right alongside Israel? How come we don't see those groups today? Sociologists tell us that when a nation is outside of its land for a few generations, it just assimilates. It loses its cultural identity and assimilates into the host culture. And yet here is tiny Israel outside of its land for 2,000 years. They never assimilated. And they go back into that same land with their religion intact, their language intact. Wouldn't you say that's a miracle? And that's the miracle that we're seeing today. And so we're living in amazing times where God is doing things in an extraordinary, miraculous way. You know, Mark Twain, looking at slide number 45, visited the land of Israel around 1867. He wrote about it in his book, Innocents Abroad, 1869, and this is what he says of Israel: a desolate country whose soil is rich enough, but is given over wholly to weeds, a silent, mournful expanse. A desolation is here that is not even imagination can grace with the pomp of life and action. We never saw a human being on the whole route. There was hardly a tree or a shrub anywhere. Even the olive tree and the cactus, those fast friends of worthless soil, had almost deserted the country. It was a barren expanse when Mark Twain visited that part of the world in 1867. And now look at Israel today. Look at slide 46. Some have referred to Israel as the miracle on the Mediterranean. She has, post-1948, created a gross domestic product outstripping that of her neighbors. That's quite a transition that's happened in that part of the world from the barren expanse where Mark Twain saw, where he said we never saw a human being on the whole route. And so we're living in amazing times where this miracle is happening. You say, well, what's your point? My point is, if you're a replacement theologian, you don't even see the significance of this. Because you don't believe in a future for the nation of Israel. You think what's happening in the Middle East is just a fluke. You're denying a modern-day miracle of God. Replacement theologian, looking at slide 47, Anthony Campolo, says this of the nation of Israel. He calls Israel a little nation that has survived primarily because of the wealth and the war materials supplied by the United States government. There's nothing significant or miraculous about the nation of Israel as far as replacement theologian Anthony Campolo is concerned. Israel's just a fluke, and she wouldn't even exist had it not been for the help of the United States of America. I wish Anthony Campolo would become aware of a little secret, and here's the secret. It really isn't a secret. Israel doesn't need America because Israel has a covenant from God. Rather, it's the other way around. America needs Israel because God said, I'll bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. But notice the blinders that go on to what God is doing in the Middle East when you buy into replacement theology. Notice this quote from Lynne Hybels, married to Bill Hybels of Willow Creek fame. And Lynne Hybels says this: I do not hold to a theology asserting that the modern state of Israel represents a divinely mandated return of ancient Israel to the promised land. In other words, she sees no theological significance at all to this miracle on the Mediterranean. And this is what replacement theology does to you. It blinds you to the very miracle that God is performing in our midst. This takes us to a sixth problem with replacement theology. Replacement theology, number 6, furthers anti-Semitism in our world. Replacement theology cooperates with anti-Semitism, or the irrational hatred for the physical descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What is to be our attitude as Christians towards the nation of Israel? Notice what Paul says, slide number 50, Romans 15, verse 27. He was raising money for the struggling saints financially in Jerusalem. And in the process of raising that money, Paul says this about Gentiles participating in that offering project. Yes, they were pleased to do so, and they are indebted to them. Gentile Christians being indebted to Jews. Look, why? For if the Gentiles have shared in their spiritual things, they are indebted to minister to them also in material things. Close quote. Paul says, you Gentiles wouldn't have anything had it not been for God's work through the physical descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so since that's true, in a sense, you're indebted to them. You owe them. So you ought to have a charitable attitude towards the Jewish people, not a hostile attitude. And you should help them physically, just as they have helped you spiritually. And as long as the church operates according to that guideline, it functions as sort of a restraint, a barrier, a bulwark, if you will, against anti-Semitism in our world. And make no mistake about it, anti-Semitism is alive and well on planet Earth today. Looking at slide number 51, whether it comes from Adolf Hitler, Ahmadinejad, formerly the leader of Iran. And if the church ever changes its mindset and stops wanting to be a blessing to the nation of Israel, it will buy into very fast the anti-Semitism of the world. And this is what replacement theology does. It cuts off Israel. It tells the Christian that God no longer has a future for Israel. And if that's true, why should I be a blessing to the Jewish people? And that barrier or that restraint against anti-Semitism is suddenly removed. And suddenly the church finds itself cooperating with anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is alive and well. Looking at slide 52, here's a quote from one of the leading imams operating in the United States of America today, Yasser Qadi. And here he's arguing that the Jews in the Middle East really aren't Jews. And he talks about how they are not the descendants of Jacob. And then he goes on and he says Hitler really never intended to mass destroy the Jews. And then he goes on promoting a book called The Hoax of the Holocaust. This is this mindset of the world today in many quarters or corners concerning Israel. And what serves as a restraint against this type of mindset? It's an evangelical church that wants to be a blessing to the nation of Israel. But if replacement theology is true and God has canceled Israel, Israel has no hope as a nation or a future, then what's the incentive to be a blessing to the Jewish people? And so that restraint against anti-Semitism is removed, and the church actually starts to cooperate with anti-Semitism. Make no mistake about it, the church has a history of cooperating with anti-Semitism. Notice this quote here from Martin Luther in his tract entitled The Jews and Their Lies. Notice what Luther says. I happen to have a lot of respect for Luther in terms of what he accomplished in church history, but he had a dark side. And this shows you how anti-Semitism can even overtake the best and the brightest within modern-day evangelicalism. Luther says, first, concerning the Jews, their synagogues should be set on fire. Their homes should likewise be broken down and destroyed. Thirdly, they should be deprived of their prayer books and Talmuds. Fourthly, their rabbis must be forbidden under threat of death to teach anymore. Fifthly, passport and traveling privileges should be absolutely forbidden to the Jews. Sixthly, they ought to be stopped from charging interest on loans. Seventhly, let the young Jews and Jewesses be given the flail, the axe, the hoe, the spade, the distaff, the spindle. Let them earn their bread by the sweat of their noses. We ought to drive their rascally lazy bones out of our system. Therefore, away with them, to sum up, dear princes and nobles who have Jews in your domains. If this advice of mine does not suit you, then find a better one, that you and we may all be free of this insufferable, devilish burden, the Jews. John Calvin, a near contemporary of Martin Luther, was a little bit more restrained in his open verbal attacks against the Jewish people, but that same anti-Semitism was clearly alive and well in the heart of John Calvin as well. John Calvin, concerning the Jews, in his commentary on the book of Daniel, says this: God has so blinded the whole people that they were like restive dogs. I have had much conversation with many Jews. I have never seen neither a drop of piety or a grain of truth or ingenuineness. Nay, I have never found common sense in any Jew. I mean, if replacement theology is true, the incentive to being a blessing to the Jewish people is removed, and the church, sadly, finds itself cooperating with the anti-Semitic philosophies of the day. And this is a posture that the church has taken in the past, and it could easily come back if the church moves into replacement theology. Joel chapter 3, verse 2 says, in the last days, the nations are going to want to divide the land of Israel. Charles Lee Feinberg, in his commentary on Zechariah chapter 12, says this: all the nations of the earth will be smitten by the virus of anti-Semitism in the last days. That's what the world community is going to want to do in the last days. It's going to want to take the land of Israel and divide it. Notice this map here, slide number 60, just to show you how irrational this is. That green outer area represents Islamic countries or nations. That tiny red dot, in fact, it's so small you probably can't even see it. We had to put an arrow with the word Israel next to it just so you could locate Israel on the map. That tiny red dot is Israel. And what does the world community today want to do? What does the United Nations want to do? What it's saying is, well, Israel just needs to give up a little bit more land, and then we'll all be happy. And when you look at this map, by the way, they're not going to show you this map on CNN News, are they? But when you look at this map, you see how irrational that is. And if the church is infected with the strain of replacement theology, then who is going to stand up and say this is wrong? In fact, the church will cooperate with this desire to further divide the land of Israel. In fact, even as I speak, I could mention 2 or 3 Protestant denominations that, as I speak, are right now, as Christians, involved in a formal boycott of the nation of Israel. They're cooperating with what's happening all over college campuses today called the BDS movement, which stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. Boycott and divestment and sanctions against who? Against the nation of Israel. And so that would be a sixth reason why replacement theology should be rejected, because replacement theology, as I've tried to explain, furthers anti-Semitism in our world. And one more, seventh reason why replacement theology should be rejected, and with this we will be finished. Number 7, replacement theology puts a person on the wrong side of God's dealings. It puts a person on the wrong side of God. Going back to Genesis 12 and verse 3, slide 62, and then very quickly 63, God says, I will bless those who bless you. And what else does he say there in slide 63, Genesis 12 verse 3, and the one who curses you, I will curse. In fact, looking at slide 64, over in the book of Zechariah, chapter 2 and verse 8, concerning Israel, God says, whoever touches you touches the apple of his eye. The apple of his eye is the pupil. So if you come against the Jewish people, it's almost like you're taking your finger and you're jamming it into God's very eye, and you're daring God to do something about it. Now, let me ask you a question. Do you want to be cursed or do you want to be blessed? I mean, is there anybody out there that you can think of that doesn't want to be blessed? We all want to be blessed. So how do we get blessed? How do we get on the right side of God? Well, we honor what he said in Genesis 12, verse 3. If you're a blessing to the Jewish people, God will be a blessing to you. And the opposite is true. And so if you buy into replacement theology, you just picked a side, didn't you? You're cutting off Israel, and consequently you're putting yourself on the wrong side of the ledger. Looking at slide 65, I challenge folks to go home today, or if you're home, maybe you could do this right after we get off the air, is read Revelation chapter 12. When you go through Revelation chapter 12, you're going to see 4 characters. The Son, S-O-N, is the Messiah. The dragon is Satan. And then there's a woman clothed with the sun and the moon and the 12 stars. You're not going to be able to interpret her correctly until you look at Genesis 37, verses 9 and 10, slide 66 and 67, related to Joseph's dream, where Joseph says this at the age of 17. Now he still had another dream and related it to his brothers. Lo, I have still had another dream. Behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars, Joseph being the 12th star, were bowing down to me. Genesis 37, verse 10, he related it to his father, that would be Jacob, and to his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream you have had? Shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come and bow ourselves down before you? You'll see the same imagery in Revelation chapter 12 and verse 1. So the sun, S-U-N, is Jacob. The moon is Jacob's wife. The 11 stars are Jacob's brothers. And the 12th star is, may have had that wrong. Let me restate that. The sun is Jacob. The moon is Jacob's wife. The 11 stars would be Jacob's sons, which would include Jacob's dozen, the 12 tribes. And so they would be Joseph's brother, Joseph being the 12th star. So you put that whole package together, and the sun and the moon and the 12 stars represents the nation of Israel. So what is happening in Revelation chapter 12 is the dragon, Satan, is trying to destroy the nation of Israel, and God is trying to protect the nation of Israel. So when you take a position on Israel, you're picking a side in the angelic conflict. Do you want to be on Satan's side or God's side? If you adopt a theology which cuts off Israel, you just took Satan's side in the angelic conflict. If you want to speak up on behalf of Israel and defend Israel the way we're doing it here, you're taking God's side in the angelic conflict. See, this whole issue of replacement theology is no minor matter. In fact, it's a very serious matter because it determines whether you're going to be blessed or cursed according to Genesis 12, verse 3, and it determines which side of the angelic conflict you find yourself on. And so the seventh reason why replacement theology should be rejected is it puts people, if it's not rejected, on the wrong side of divine dealings. So in conclusion, I hope you enjoyed this very fast lesson that we gave you today on the 7 problems with replacement theology. We have defined replacement theology, and we've given 7 reasons why it should be rejected. Number 1, it's unbiblical. Number 2, it was never considered part of early Christianity. Number 3, it's ultimately rooted in pride. Number 4, if it's true, it renders all of God's promises as unreliable. Number 5, once you believe in replacement theology, it blinds you to what God is doing today concerning the regathering of the nation of Israel as his special miracle. Number 6, it furthers anti-Semitism in our world. It cooperates with anti-Semitism. It doesn't act as a restraint against it. And then finally, number 7, it puts a person on the wrong side of divine dealings. So I hope you enjoyed Pastor's point of view for today. Given the length of our talk, we're going to have to sort of sign off at this point. But next week, we hope to be back on our regular schedule. Brother Jim should be here with me. We'll be having our pastor's point of view on Friday rather than Thursday, and we'll have plenty of time to interact with your comments and questions, not only from next week, but we'll cycle back and take a look at the comments and questions you put on the comment box on Facebook as well, and we'll take a look at those. So at this time, we'll sign off. God bless you. We love you. We're praying for you, and we hope you'll pray for us as well. God bless.